The blizzard hit with such ferocity that Quincy Yardley could barely see his own hand in front of his face as he secured the barn door against the howling wind. Snow whipped sideways across his Montana ranch, and he knew this was going to be one of those storms that people talked about for years afterward. It was December of 1878, and winter had come early and brutal to the territory just north of Fort Collins, where Quincy had staked his claim 3 years prior after leaving Texas, and everything he had known behind. He fought his way back toward the cabin, his boots sinking deep into rapidly accumulating drifts. The cold cut through his heavy coat like knives, and he was grateful when he finally pushed through his door and slammed it shut behind him. Ice crystals clung to his beard and eyebrows as he stripped off his outer layers and moved toward the fireplace to add more wood. The cabin was small but sturdy, built with his own hands from lodgepole pine, and it had weathered storms before. He settled into his chair with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind shriek outside, and resigned himself to being trapped inside for at least a day or two. That was when he heard it. A faint sound that did not belong to the storm. Quincy straightened in his chair, listening harder. There it was again, a sort of scratching or thumping at his door. His hand went instinctively to the rifle propped against the wall as he approached cautiously. Mountain lions sometimes got desperate in weather like this, and he was not about to open his door to a predator. The thumping came again, weaker this time, and then he heard something that made his heart skip. A voice. Human. Female. Barely audible over the wind but unmistakably calling for help. Quincy threw open the door and was immediately hit by a blast of snow and wind. At first he saw nothing, but then he looked down and there was a figure collapsed on his doorstep, covered in snow, shaking violently. Without hesitation, he bent and scooped the person up, surprised by how light she was, and carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He laid her on his bed and immediately began brushing the snow from her clothes and face. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered to her head and skin that had gone dangerously pale. Her lips were blue and she was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open and closed as violent shivers racked her body. "Can you hear me?" Quincy asked, his voice urgent. "What is your name?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her clothes were soaked through, and Quincy knew he had to get her warm immediately or she would die. He had seen men freeze to death before, and he recognized the signs. Moving quickly but carefully, he pulled off her wet coat and boots. Her dress beneath was also soaked. He hesitated for only a moment, then reminded himself this was life or death. Modesty had no place when someone was dying of exposure. He grabbed one of his thick flannel shirts and a pair of wool socks, then turned his back to give her what privacy he could. "Miss, I need to get you out of these wet clothes or you are going to freeze to death. Can you manage it yourself?" There was no response. He glanced back and saw she had lost consciousness entirely. Cursing under his breath, Quincy did what had to be done, working as quickly and respectfully as possible to remove her wet dress and undergarments and get her into his dry shirt. It hung on her like a tent, but it was warm and dry. He pulled the wool socks onto her icy feet, then wrapped her in every blanket he owned and laid her close to the fireplace. For the next hour, he worked to warm her slowly. He knew better than to warm someone too quickly after severe cold exposure. He heated water and carefully spooned warm broth between her lips when she was conscious enough to swallow. He kept the fire roaring and rubbed her hands and feet gently to encourage circulation. Slowly, gradually, color began to return to her face, and her shivering lessened. It was near midnight when her eyes finally opened and stayed open. She looked around in confusion, then her gaze settled on Quincy, who was sitting in a chair nearby, watching over her. Where am I? Her voice was hoarse and weak. My cabin, about 15 miles north of Fort Collins. You showed up on my doorstep half frozen. What is your name, miss? What were you doing out in a storm like this? She tried to sit up, but he gently pushed her back down. Easy now. You have been through quite an ordeal, just rest. Georgia, she whispered. My name is Georgia Emerson. I was traveling from Cheyenne to Fort Collins when the storm hit. Our wagon got stuck and the horses panicked. I got separated from the others. Her eyes filled with tears. My father, the driver, I do not know what happened to them. Quincy felt his chest tighten with sympathy. How long were you wandering out there? I do not know. Hours, maybe. I saw your light through the snow. I thought I was seeing things, that I was already dead and seeing heaven. She looked up at him with eyes that were a remarkable shade of green, even reddened from cold and exhaustion. You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same, Quincy said gruffly, uncomfortable with gratitude. You just rest now. The storm is still raging out there. Nobody is going anywhere until it passes. When it does, we will go looking for your father and the others. Georgia nodded weakly and closed her eyes again. Within moments she was asleep, her breathing deep and even. Quincy watched her for a long time, this stranger who had literally blown into his life on a winter wind. She was beautiful, even half frozen and exhausted. But more than that, there had been something in her eyes. Intelligence, strength, determination. She had survived hours in a blizzard that would have killed most people. He finally forced himself to look away and tend to practical matters. He hung her wet clothes near the fire to dry and checked on his animals in the attached lean-to barn. His horse and 2 cows were fine, warm enough and with plenty of hay. When he returned, Georgia was still sleeping peacefully. Quincy made himself a bed on the floor near the fire and tried to sleep, but found himself listening to her breathe, making sure she was all right. The storm raged for 2 full days. During that time, Quincy and Georgia were trapped together in the small cabin, and Quincy found himself learning about this remarkable woman who had stumbled into his life. Georgia was 24 years old, the daughter of a merchant from Philadelphia. Her mother had died when she was young, and she had been raised by her father, who had treated her more like a son than a daughter in many ways. He had taught her to read and write and keep accounts, unusual for a woman of the time. They had been traveling west because her father wanted to open a new store in the growing town of Fort Collins, seeing opportunity in the expanding frontier. He always said I had a head for business, Georgia told Quincy on the second day, when she was feeling much stronger and was up and moving around the cabin. She had insisted on making herself useful and was preparing a meal from Quincy's supplies. Most fathers would have tried to marry me off by now, but mine wanted me to learn the trade. He said I was too smart to waste on just keeping house. Sounds like a good man, Quincy observed, watching her work. She moved with practiced efficiency, comfortable in a kitchen despite her unusual upbringing. He is, Georgia's voice caught. I keep going back and forth. I do not know if he is alive or dead out there. Quincy stood and placed a hand on her shoulder. As soon as this storm breaks, we will find out. I promise you that. She looked up at him, and something passed between them in that moment. An understanding, a connection. Quincy felt it like a physical thing, and he saw in her eyes that she felt it too. He quickly pulled his hand back and stepped away, suddenly feeling like the cabin was very small indeed. To distract himself, he started telling her about his own story. How he had been a cowboy in Texas, working other men's ranches, until he had saved enough to strike out on his own. How he had come to Montana because land was available and he had wanted to build something that was his. How he had been alone on this ranch for 3 years, seeing other people only when he went into town for supplies every few months. That sounds lonely, Georgia said softly. Quincy shrugged. I chose it. After what I saw during the war and after, I wanted peace and quiet. I wanted to be somewhere where the only things I had to worry about were the weather and the cattle. You fought in the war. I did. For the South, though I never owned slaves and did not believe in it. I fought because Texas was my home and my friends were fighting. I was 16 when I enlisted, 20 when it ended. I saw things no boy should see. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. When I came home, everything was different, broken. I could not settle back into the life I had known. So I worked and saved and came here to start fresh. Georgia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I think that is very brave, starting over, building something new, or running away, depending on how you look at it. I do not think you are a man who runs from anything, Quincy Yardley. The way she said his name sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He glanced at her and found her watching him with those intelligent green eyes, and he had to look away before he did something foolish. That night, Quincy gave Georgia the bed again while he slept on the floor. But he found himself lying awake, intensely aware of her presence just a few feet away. He kept telling himself she was just a woman in need of help, that she would be gone as soon as the storm passed, that there was no point in feeling anything for her. But his heart was not listening to his head. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts were piled higher than Quincy's head in places, and the landscape was an endless expanse of white beneath a painfully blue sky. We need to find your father, Quincy said as soon as he had checked the conditions outside. Can you ride? Yes, Georgia said immediately, and I am coming with you. It will be hard going in this snow. I do not care. He is my father, Quincy nodded, having expected nothing less from her. He saddled his horse, a strong bay gelding named Buck, and helped Georgia up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist to hold on, and he tried to ignore how right it felt to have her pressed against his back. They set out following the main trail toward Fort Collins, Quincy watching for any signs of the wagon Georgia had described. The going was slow and treacherous. Buck struggled through the deep snow, and they had to stop frequently to let him rest. The cold was fierce, and Quincy was grateful he had insisted Georgia wear his second coat and extra scarves. They had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours when Georgia suddenly gripped his arm. There. I see something. Quincy squinted in the direction she was pointing and saw a dark shape protruding from a snowdrift. As they got closer, his heart sank. It was the wagon, or what was left of it. It was on its side, half buried in snow, one wheel broken. There was no sign of horses or people. Georgia slid down from Buck before Quincy could stop her and ran toward the wreck. "Father, Mr. Henderson," she called out, her voice breaking with desperation. Quincy dismounted and began searching the area methodically, looking for any signs of survivors or bodies. He found tracks, mostly filled in by snow but still visible, leading away from the wagon in 2 different directions. "Human tracks and horse tracks. Georgia," he called out, "come here and look at this." She hurried over, her face pale with fear and hope. He pointed to the tracks. "Looks like at least 2 people walked away from this, and the horses went that direction. Your father might have made it. But where would they go? There is nothing out here. There is a line shack about 3 miles south of here. I use it sometimes when I am working the far pastures. If they knew about it or stumbled across it, they might have sheltered there." Hope flared in Georgia's eyes. "Can we check?" "We are going to check everywhere we need to until we find them," Quincy promised. They followed the tracks as best they could, though the wind and snow had obscured much of the trail. It took them another hour of hard riding to reach the line shack, which was little more than a crude 1-room structure with a fireplace, and some basic supplies that Quincy kept stocked. As they approached, Quincy felt a surge of hope. Smoke was rising from the chimney. "Someone is there," Georgia cried out. They urged Buck forward, and before the horse had fully stopped, Georgia was sliding down and running toward the door. She threw it open, and then Quincy heard her sob with relief. "Father!" Quincy dismounted and followed her inside. The lined shack was cramped with 3 people inside. An older man with gray hair and a weathered face was sitting near the fire, his leg wrapped in makeshift bandages. A younger man, probably the wagon driver, was tending the fire. Both men looked up in shock when Georgia burst in. "Georgia, thank God!" The older man tried to stand but collapsed back with a grunt of pain. Georgia rushed to his side, throwing her arms around him and weeping. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed. "I thought I had lost you." "I am all right, daughter. Just a broken leg from when the wagon tipped. Henderson here got me to this shelter, but we feared you had perished in the storm. We were going to try to search for you once my leg improved, but—" He looked at Quincy, who was standing respectfully near the door. "Who is this?" Georgia wiped her eyes and stood, though she kept one hand on her father's shoulder. "This is Quincy Yardley. He saved my life. I made it to his cabin during the storm, and he took me in. We came looking for you as soon as the weather cleared." The older man extended his hand to Quincy. "Marcus Emerson, I am more grateful than I can say. My daughter is everything to me." Quincy shook his hand. "She is a strong woman. She survived hours in that blizzard. Not many could have done that." "She gets that from her mother," Marcus said with a sad smile. "Henderson, this is the man who saved Georgia." The driver, a lean man in his 30s, nodded to Quincy. "Thomas Henderson, we are in your debt, sir." "No debt," Quincy said firmly. "But we need to get you all somewhere with better shelter and medical care. Marcus, that leg needs to be looked at properly." "Agreed," Marcus said, "but I am not sure I can ride in this condition." "We will make a travois," Quincy said. "Buck is strong enough to pull it. It will take us longer, but we will get you to Fort Collins." Over the next several hours, Quincy constructed a simple travois using materials from the lined shack and some rope he had in his saddlebags. They made Marcus as comfortable as possible on it, and then the small group set out toward Fort Collins. It was slow, hard going. The snow was still deep, and the temperature was dropping as the sun began to set. They had to stop frequently to rest Buck and check on Marcus. Georgia walked beside the travois for much of the journey, holding her father's hand and talking to him to keep his spirits up. Quincy found himself watching her, marveling at her strength and determination. She had been through a terrifying ordeal, but she was not falling apart. She was doing what needed to be done. As night fell, Quincy made the difficult decision to stop and make camp rather than push on in the dark. The risk of injury was too great. He found a spot with some natural windbreak and got a fire going. Georgia helped him set up a simple shelter using blankets and evergreen branches. They took turns staying awake to keep the fire going through the night. During one of Quincy's watches, Georgia came and sat beside him. Marcus and Henderson were both asleep. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. For saving me, for finding my father, for all of this. You do not need to keep thanking me." "Yes, I do, because you did not have to do any of it. You could have turned me away. You could have sent me on my way as soon as the storm passed, but you did not." Quincy looked at her in the firelight. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and her green eyes reflected the flames. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I could not have done any of those things," he said softly. "From the moment I carried you through that door, I knew I would do whatever it took to keep you safe." Georgia's breath caught. She reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "Quincy, But whatever she was going to say was interrupted by Marcus stirring and groaning in pain. Georgia immediately went to her father, and the moment passed. But Quincy felt the echo of her touch long into the night. They reached Fort Collins the next afternoon. The town was still digging out from the storm, but people rushed to help when they saw the bedraggled group arriving. Marcus was taken to the doctor's house, where his leg was properly set and bandaged. The doctor, an older man named Walter Price, said Marcus had been lucky. It was a clean break and should heal well, though he would be off his feet for weeks. The town only had one hotel, a modest establishment called the Silver Creek Inn. Marcus insisted on paying for rooms for all of them. Henderson was going to stay on as Marcus's employee, and father and daughter were clearly going to need help while Marcus recovered. That first night in town, after everyone was settled and fed, Quincy stood on the hotel porch and looked out at the snow-covered street. He had been planning to head back to his ranch tomorrow. His animals would be fine for a few days, but he did not like leaving them longer than that. But the thought of leaving Georgia made his chest ache. "You are thinking about going home." Her voice came from behind him. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. "I need to check on my place. Make sure everything weathered the storm all right. I know." She stepped out onto the porch and came to stand beside him. "I do not want you to go." Her honesty took his breath away. "Georgia, I know it is improper. I know I should not say such things. But these past few days, being with you, I have felt something I have never felt before. Like I could talk to you about anything. Like you see me, really see me, not just as a woman or a daughter or anything else, but as a person." Quincy turned to face her fully. "I do see you, and what I see is the most remarkable woman I have ever met. You are smart and strong and brave. You are kind and determined. And I have been fighting what I feel for you because it seemed impossible. You are a city woman from Philadelphia. I am a cowboy who lives alone in a cabin miles from anywhere. We are from different worlds." "Maybe we were," Georgia said, stepping closer to him. "But does that matter? Here now, on this frontier, we can be whoever we choose to be. We can build whatever life we want. Your father needs you. His business. My father wants me to be happy. And I think, given how you saved both our lives, he would not object to me getting to know you better." Quincy reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "You do not know what you are saying. Life on a ranch is hard, lonely, nothing like what you are used to. I do not need fancy things, Quincy. I need purpose. I need to feel alive. And when I am with you, I feel more alive than I ever have." He knew he should step back, knew he should be sensible. But instead, he bent his head and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and filled with all the emotions he had been trying to hold back. Georgia's arms came around his neck and she kissed him back with equal tenderness. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard. "Stay," Georgia whispered. "Just a few more days. Give us a chance to see if this is real." "It is real," Quincy said hoarsely. "I have known it since the first moment I saw your eyes open. But I will stay. I will stay as long as you want me to." The next few weeks were a revelation for Quincy. He sent a message to his ranch hand, a young man named Pete who helped out when needed, asking him to check on the animals. Then he settled into the strange new rhythm of town life. He helped Georgia and Henderson get Marcus's business started, despite the older man's injury. The store they had planned to open was still a possibility, and there was much work to be done. Quincy found himself using skills he had not known he possessed. He helped negotiate with suppliers, unload freight wagons, and set up the storefront that Marcus had purchased sight unseen based on correspondence with a Fort Collins real estate agent. But more than the work, he treasured the time with Georgia. They took walks together through the snow-covered town. They had long conversations over dinner about everything from books to politics to dreams for the future. They made each other laugh. They challenged each other's ideas. And they grew closer with each passing day. Marcus watched the developing romance with a knowing eye. One evening, about 3 weeks after they had arrived in town, he asked to speak with Quincy privately. "I am a plain-spoken man, Mr. Yardley," Marcus said, sitting with his injured leg propped up in his hotel room. "So I will get to the point. You have feelings for my daughter." "I do, sir, strong feelings, and I hope I have not been disrespectful in any way." "On the contrary. You have been entirely proper, which I appreciate, but I am also not blind. Georgia feels the same way about you. I have never seen her look at anyone the way she looks at you." Quincy felt his heart begin to race. "Mr. Emerson, I know I am not what most fathers would want for their daughters. I do not have much money. I live simply. But I care for Georgia more than I have ever cared for anyone. I would spend the rest of my life making her happy if she would let me." Marcus smiled. "I told you I am a plain-spoken man, so let me be clear. You are exactly what I want for my daughter. You are honest, hardworking. You saved both our lives, and more importantly, you see Georgia for who she truly is. You do not try to change her or limit her. You encourage her mind and her spirit. She is extraordinary, she is, and she deserves someone extraordinary. I think you might be that man, Quincy, but I want you to be sure. Georgia is used to a certain level of civilization. Can you truly offer her a life on an isolated ranch? Will you resent her if she struggles with the hardship?" "I would never resent her for anything," Quincy said firmly. "And as for the ranch, I have been thinking about that. I do not want her to be isolated and lonely. If she is willing to share that life with me, I would make sure we came to town more often. I would build onto the cabin, make it more comfortable. I would do whatever it takes to make her happy." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then you have my blessing to court her properly, and if things develop as I suspect they will, you will have my blessing for more than that." Quincy felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you, sir. That means more than I can say." That night, Quincy asked Georgia to take a walk with him despite the cold. They bundled up warmly and strolled through the quiet streets, their breath making clouds in the freezing air. "I spoke with your father today," Quincy said when they reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. "Oh, what about us?" He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Georgia, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, spending time with you, it has changed everything for me. I came to Montana to be alone, to build a life in solitude. But now the thought of going back to that cabin without you makes it feel like a prison instead of a home." Georgia's eyes shone in the moonlight. "Quincy, what are you saying?" "I am saying that I love you. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a short time, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love your mind and your strength and your laugh and the way you see the world. I love everything about you." "Oh, Quincy." Tears spilled down Georgia's cheeks. "I love you too. I have been afraid to say it, afraid you would think I was silly or too forward, but I do. I love you so much." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply. She melted against him, and for a long moment they stood there under the stars, lost in each other. When they finally pulled apart, Quincy said, "Your father gave me permission to court you properly. So that is what I want to do. I want to do this right. I want everyone to know that you are the woman I love and that I intend to marry you if you will have me." "Are you proposing?" Georgia asked with a shaky laugh. "Not yet. When I propose, I want to have a ring. I want to do it properly. But I am telling you my intentions. I am telling you that I want you to be my wife, to share my life, to build a future together. Then I am telling you that I want all of that too. I want to be your wife more than I have ever wanted anything." They kissed again, and Quincy felt like his heart might burst from happiness. The lonely cowboy who had thought he wanted solitude had found something infinitely better. He had found love. Over the next 2 months, Quincy courted Georgia with all the propriety that the time demanded. He called on her at appropriate hours. They went on chaperoned outings. He brought her small gifts, wildflowers that he found blooming impossibly in sheltered spots, a book of poetry he ordered from back east, a warm scarf he bought from the general store. But more than the rituals of courtship, they talked. They learned everything about each other. Georgia told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about the mother she barely remembered, about the books she loved to read and her dreams of adventure. Quincy told her about his childhood in Texas, about the war and its horrors, about the peace he found in working with his hands and being close to the land. Marcus's store was doing well. Fort Collins was growing, and there was strong demand for quality goods. Georgia helped run the business, and Quincy was impressed by her sharp mind for numbers and her skill at negotiating with suppliers. She had a gift for knowing what people wanted before they knew it themselves. In early March, as winter began to loosen its grip and the first hints of spring appeared, Quincy made a trip back to his ranch. Georgia wanted to see it, to understand the life he was offering her. Marcus had recovered enough to manage the store with Henderson's help for a few days. The ride took most of a day, and they arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. Quincy helped Georgia down from her horse and watched nervously as she looked around. He tried to see it through her eyes. The small cabin that suddenly seemed crude and rough. The barn that needed repairs. The land that was beautiful but empty and isolated. "It is perfect," Georgia said softly. Quincy blinked in surprise. "Perfect, Georgia, it is rough, I know that. I can make improvements, build on, make it better." She turned to him with shining eyes. "No, you do not understand. It is perfect because it is yours, because you built it with your own hands, because it represents your dreams and your hard work. How could I not love it?" She walked around the property, asking questions about everything. Where did he plan to expand the pastures? What crops grew best in this soil? How many cattle did he want to run eventually? She was not just being polite. She genuinely wanted to know, wanted to understand the life they would build together. That night, Quincy cooked dinner for her in the cabin. It was simple fare, beef and beans and biscuits, but Georgia ate like it was a feast. Afterward, they sat by the fire and Quincy finally pulled out the small box he had been carrying in his pocket for days. "Georgia Emerson," he said, dropping to one knee before her. "I know I am just a cowboy with a small ranch and big dreams. I cannot offer you fancy dresses or servants or a grand house in the city, but I can offer you my whole heart. I can offer you a partnership in building something real and lasting. I can offer you my love, my loyalty, and my promise to spend every day of my life trying to make you happy. Will you marry me?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small but clear diamond. He had spent most of his savings on it, riding to Denver to find something worthy of her. Georgia's hands flew to her mouth and tears streamed down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Quincy slipped the ring onto her finger and she pulled him up to kiss her. They clung to each other, laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the joy and rightness of the moment. "I cannot wait to be your wife," Georgia said. "I cannot wait to start our life together." "We can get married as soon as you want," Quincy promised. "Tomorrow if you like." Georgia laughed. "My father would never forgive us if we did not give him time to plan a proper wedding, and I want to do this right. I want to stand up in front of the whole town and pledge my life to you." They spent that night talking and planning their future. Georgia had ideas for the ranch that Quincy had never considered. She wanted to plant a large vegetable garden and maybe some fruit trees. She wanted to raise chickens for eggs and sell the surplus in town. She wanted to add rooms to the cabin, including a library where they could keep books and a proper kitchen. "You have really thought about this," Quincy marveled. "Of course I have. This is going to be my home too. Our home. I want to make it everything it can be." They rode back to Fort Collins the next day to share the news. Marcus was overjoyed, though not surprised. He threw his arms around both of them and declared that they needed to have a proper celebration. The wedding was planned for early May, giving them time to make preparations. Georgia worked with the local seamstress to create a simple but beautiful dress. Quincy ordered a new suit from Denver. Marcus insisted on hosting a reception dinner at the hotel for the whole town. As the date approached, Quincy found himself both excited and terrified. He had never imagined himself as a married man, and now he could not imagine any other future. Georgia had become essential to him, like breathing. The night before the wedding, Marcus asked to speak with Quincy again. "Tomorrow you are going to become my son," the older man said. "And I want you to know how proud I am of that. You are a good man, Quincy Yardley. You will take care of my girl." "I will, sir. I swear it." "I know you will, but I want to give you something." He handed Quincy an envelope. "This is the deed to this building, the one housing the store. I am signing it over to you and Georgia as a wedding gift." Quincy stared at the envelope in shock. "Mr. Emerson, I cannot accept this. It is too much." "You can and you will. Georgia has put her heart and soul into this business. It is as much hers as mine. And I know you two plan to live on the ranch, but having this property gives you security. You can lease it out for income or come into town and run the business yourselves during slow times on the ranch. It gives you options. I do not know what to say." "Say thank you and promise me you will take care of my daughter." "I promise. And thank you, sir, truly." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. Spring had arrived in full force, and the town was alive with the sound of birds and the smell of growing things. The ceremony was held in the small church at the center of town. It seemed like the entire population of Fort Collins turned out to witness the union. Quincy stood at the altar in his new suit, his hands shaking slightly as he waited. Then the doors opened and Georgia appeared on her father's arm, and Quincy forgot how to breathe. She was radiant in her white dress, her dark hair piled on top of her head with a few curls framing her face. But it was her smile that undid him. She was smiling at him like he was the only person in the world, like he was her whole future walking toward him. The ceremony was simple and traditional. They exchanged vows in voices that only shook a little. Quincy slipped the wedding band he had bought onto her finger next to the engagement ring. And when the preacher finally said, "You may kiss your bride," Quincy did so with all the love and promise he could pour into that single moment. The reception was a joyful affair. The entire hotel dining room had been decorated with spring flowers. There was food and music and dancing. Quincy, who had never been much for dancing, found himself swept onto the floor by his new wife. Georgia laughed as he stumbled through the steps, and her joy was infectious. As the sun began to set, and the party showed no signs of slowing, Quincy and Georgia slipped away. They had decided to spend their wedding night at the ranch, their ranch now, beginning their married life in the place they would build their future. The ride through the spring twilight was magical. Everything seemed fresh and new and full of possibility. When they arrived at the cabin, Quincy dismounted and then lifted Georgia down from her horse. Instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her to the door. "I believe this is traditional," he said with a grin. "Very traditional," Georgia agreed, her arms around his neck. He carried her over the threshold and kicked the door closed behind them. The cabin was just as they had left it, but it felt different now. It felt like a home. Their home. That night, They began their life together as husband and wife in every sense. And in the days and weeks that followed, they settled into the rhythm of their new life. Georgia adapted to ranch life with remarkable ease. She threw herself into every aspect of it, learning to milk cows, tend the vegetable garden she had planted, and even help with some of the lighter ranch work. She was up before dawn each day, working alongside Quincy with enthusiasm and determination. But she also brought changes that made the rough ranch life more civilized. She hung curtains in the windows and put flowers on the table. She organized Quincy's chaotic collection of tools and supplies. She cooked meals that were far more elaborate than the simple fare Quincy had been subsisting on, and she brought laughter and conversation to the long evenings. They would sit by the fire after dinner, and Georgia would read aloud from books while Quincy worked on tack repairs or whittled. Or they would simply talk, sharing stories and dreams and ideas. Quincy had never been happier. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by the warm presence of the woman he loved. Every day felt like a gift. They made regular trips to Fort Collins, sometimes to help Marcus with the store, sometimes just to be part of the community. Georgia had been right that having the property in town gave them flexibility. They could move between their two worlds, ranch life and town life, taking the best of both. In late summer, Georgia came to Quincy with news that filled him with joy and terror in equal measure. She was expecting a child. "Are you happy?" she asked, watching his face carefully. "I know we have not talked much about children, and it is happening so fast." Quincy swept her into his arms and spun her around, making her squeal with laughter. "Happy? I am thrilled, terrified but thrilled." They spent the next months preparing for the baby. Quincy built a cradle from pine and carved it with careful detail. Georgia sewed tiny clothes and blankets. They added another room onto the cabin to serve as a nursery. Marcus was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandfather. He fussed over Georgia during their visits to town, making sure she was eating enough and resting enough. The baby came in early March, almost exactly a year after Quincy had proposed. It was a long, difficult labor that had Quincy pacing and praying. But when he finally heard the baby's first cry and the midwife announced it was a healthy boy, Quincy felt tears stream down his face. "You have a son," the midwife said, placing the tiny wrapped bundle in his arms. Quincy looked down at the small red face and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. This was his son, his and Georgia's. "Can I see him?" Georgia's weak voice came from the bed. Quincy immediately went to her, placing the baby in her arms. Georgia looked exhausted but radiantly happy as she gazed at their child. "He is perfect," she whispered. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Quincy knew. "What about Marcus? After your father," Georgia's eyes filled with tears. "Marcus Yardley, it is perfect." When they brought baby Marcus to town to meet his grandfather, the older man wept openly. "You have given me such a gift," he told Georgia. "Thank you." The first year of Marcus's life was exhausting and wonderful. Quincy discovered reserves of patience he had not known he possessed. Georgia amazed him with her ability to handle the demands of a baby while still managing household work and even helping with some ranch tasks. They worked as a team in everything, supporting each other through the difficult moments and celebrating the joys. Marcus's first smile, his first laugh, the first time he slept through the night. As their son grew, so did the ranch. Quincy was able to expand his herd with the income from the store property. He hired a part-time ranch hand to help with the heavier work, which gave him more time with his family. Georgia continued to be involved in her father's business, making trips to town to help with ordering and bookkeeping. She had a knack for it that Marcus appreciated, and it gave her a creative outlet beyond the ranch. When Marcus was 2 years old, Georgia announced she was pregnant again. This time, Quincy was less terrified and more simply excited. They knew what to expect, and they had proven they could handle it. Their daughter was born in the fall, a small but healthy baby with her mother's green eyes. They named her Grace, for the grace that had brought them together through that terrible storm. With 2 young children, life was chaotic. The cabin that had seemed so spacious when it was just the two of them now felt cramped. So Quincy undertook a major expansion, adding several rooms and a proper second floor. George's father, who was getting older and finding the work of running the store more challenging, proposed a new arrangement. He would like to move to the ranch and help with the children while Georgia and Quincy took over more of the store operations. It was a solution that worked beautifully for everyone. Marcus the Elder, as they called him to distinguish him from young Marcus, loved being with his grandchildren. He could help supervise them while still taking time to rest his aging body. And Georgia and Quincy were able to build the store into an even more successful enterprise, using Georgia's business acumen and Quincy's expanding network of contacts among other ranchers. They fell into a rhythm that worked. Spring and summer were spent primarily on the ranch, where the work was heaviest. Fall and winter, they split their time between the ranch and town, with Marcus the Elder watching the children while they managed the store. The years passed in a blur of joy and hard work. Young Marcus grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved following his father around the ranch. Grace was quieter but equally determined, with a sharp mind like her mother's. When Marcus was 8 and Grace was 6, Georgia gave birth to twin boys, which took everyone by surprise. They named them James and John, and the household descended into joyful chaos. Quincy sometimes looked around at his life and could hardly believe it. The lonely cowboy who had wanted nothing but solitude now lived in a house full of noise and laughter and love. And he would not trade it for anything. Georgia's father lived to see all 4 of his grandchildren grow into school age, but he passed peacefully in his sleep when Marcus was 10. It was a blow to all of them, but especially to Georgia, who had been so close to her father. "He gave me everything," she told Quincy through her tears. "He raised me to be strong and independent. He supported my dreams, and he gave me his blessing to marry you, which gave me the greatest happiness of my life." "He was a good man," Quincy agreed, holding her close. "And he was so proud of you, of all of us." They buried Marcus Emerson in the Fort Collins cemetery, and half the town turned out for the funeral. He had been well loved and respected, known for his honesty in business and his generosity to those in need. In his will, Marcus left the store entirely to Georgia and Quincy, along with a sum of money he had saved. With this inheritance, they were able to make even more improvements to the ranch and secure their children's futures. As the children grew, each developed their own interests and personalities. Young Marcus loved the ranch life and spent every moment he could learning about cattle and horses. Grace showed her mother's head for business and started helping in the store as soon as she was old enough. The twins were inseparable and got into constant mischief, keeping everyone on their toes. Quincy taught his children the lessons his own father had taught him, and the lessons he had learned from life: the value of hard work, the importance of honesty, the need to treat all people with respect, regardless of their station. Georgia taught them to read and write and think critically, giving them an education that few frontier children received. When young Marcus turned 18, he announced his intention to stay on the ranch and eventually take it over. Quincy felt a profound sense of satisfaction knowing that what he had built would continue with his son. Grace, at 16, had different ambitions. She wanted to expand the store, maybe even open additional locations in other growing towns. She had her grandfather's entrepreneurial spirit and her mother's sharp mind. Quincy and Georgia supported her dreams, knowing she had the capability to achieve anything she set her mind to. The twins, at 14, were still finding their way, but they showed promise in different directions. James loved books and learning and talked about becoming a lawyer. John was drawn to medicine after a traveling doctor had spent time in Fort Collins and taken the boy under his wing. One evening, when all the children were in bed and Quincy and Georgia were sitting on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains, Georgia leaned her head on Quincy's shoulder. "Can you believe it has been almost 20 years since that storm brought me to your door?" she asked softly. Quincy wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like you have always been here. I was so lost that night, so certain I was going to die, and then you opened your door and everything changed." "You changed everything," Quincy corrected. "I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You taught me how to truly live." Georgia tilted her face up to kiss him. "We taught each other. That is what partners do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the evening, crickets chirping, a cow lowing in the distance, the wind rustling through the grass. "I have been thinking," Georgia said eventually, "about the future. The children are growing up. They will be making their own ways in the world soon. What do you want to do? Keep expanding the ranch? Focus more on the business?" Quincy considered the question. "I think I want to find a balance. Keep the ranch at a manageable size that young Marcus can handle with some help. Stay involved in the business enough to support Grace in her ambitions, and spend more time just being together. We have worked so hard for so long. Maybe it is time to enjoy the fruits of that labor a little." "I like that idea," Georgia said. "We could travel a little. See some of the places we have only read about. Visit Denver, maybe even go back east to Philadelphia so I can show you where I grew up." "I would like that. I would like to experience new things with you." As if reading his mind, Georgia said, "We have had such an extraordinary life together, haven't we? Built from nothing. Two strangers brought together by a winter storm." "The best storm that ever happened," Quincy said with a smile. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of challenges and joys. Young Marcus did indeed take over primary operation of the ranch, and he did it well, showing the same dedication and skill that his father had. He married a local girl, the daughter of another rancher, and they began their own family, giving Quincy and Georgia grandchildren. Grace expanded the business just as she had dreamed, opening a second store in a growing town to the north. She married as well, to a young man who worked for the railroad and had a head for business to match her own. The twins both went away to school, James to study law and John to study medicine. They came home for visits when they could, full of stories about their lives and studies. Quincy and Georgia found themselves with more time on their hands than they had had in years. They took advantage of it, traveling and exploring. They went to Denver and saw the opera, something Georgia had not experienced since her childhood. They traveled to San Francisco and saw the ocean. They even made the long journey back to Philadelphia, where Georgia showed Quincy the house where she had grown up and introduced him to the few relatives who still lived there. But they always returned to Montana, to the ranch that had become the center of their universe. It was home in a way no other place could be. When they were in their mid-50s, with a house full of grandchildren visiting during a summer gathering, Quincy looked around the large table where everyone was gathered for dinner and felt overwhelming gratitude. This was what he had never known he wanted. This love, this family, this legacy. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, He and Georgia walked out to the spot where they always went when they wanted to talk privately. It was a small rise that overlooked the ranch, with a view of the mountains in the distance. "You ever have regrets?" Quincy asked. "About giving up city life, about the hardships you have endured here?" Georgia looked at him with surprise. "Regrets? Quincy, I have never regretted a single moment. Yes, life here has been hard sometimes, but it has also been real and meaningful in a way I never experienced in Philadelphia. I have built something here with you. We have created this family, this legacy. How could I possibly regret that? I just want to make sure you have been happy, that I have given you a good life." "You have given me the best life," Georgia said firmly. "You have been my partner in everything. You have supported my dreams and ambitions. You have been an amazing father to our children. And you have loved me faithfully for over 20 years. What more could I possibly want?" Quincy pulled her into his arms, still overwhelmed by the miracle of having this extraordinary woman as his wife. "I love you, Georgia, more now than even on the day we married. And I love you. Always and forever." They stood there holding each other as the stars came out overhead, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that was richer and fuller than either could have imagined. As they grew older, they gradually turned more and more of the daily operations over to their children. Young Marcus ran the ranch with skill and dedication. Grace managed the business interests with shrewd intelligence. The twins visited when they could, established in their own careers and lives. Quincy and Georgia became the wise elders, the ones everyone turned to for advice and counsel. They were respected in the community not just for what they had built, but for how they had lived, with integrity, with kindness, with generosity toward those in need. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a surprise celebration. The entire town of Fort Collins turned out, along with people from surrounding communities. There were speeches about all that Quincy and Georgia had done for the area. Stories were shared about their generosity and wisdom, but the moment that meant the most to Quincy was when young Marcus stood up to speak. "My father once told me that before he met my mother, he thought he wanted to be alone," Marcus said. "He had seen too much pain and hardship, and he just wanted peace. But then a storm brought my mother to his door, and everything changed. He learned that real peace does not come from being alone. It comes from loving and being loved, from building something bigger than yourself, from creating a family and a legacy." He looked directly at Quincy and Georgia, his eyes shining with emotion. "You two taught all of us what it means to truly love someone, to be partners in every sense, to build a life together based on mutual respect and shared dreams. You gave us an example to follow, and we are all better for it. So thank you. Thank you for finding each other. Thank you for building this family, and thank you for showing us all what love can be." There was not a dry eye in the room. Quincy looked at Georgia and saw tears streaming down her face, though she was smiling. He took her hand and squeezed it, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. That night, alone in their bedroom in the cabin that had grown from a simple one-room structure to a comfortable family home, Quincy and Georgia held each other close. 30 years, Georgia marveled. "It has gone so fast. And yet I remember every moment," Quincy said. "Every joy, every challenge, every ordinary day that made up our extraordinary life." "You think we will have 30 more?" Georgia asked with a teasing smile. "I certainly plan to try," Quincy replied. "I am not finished loving you yet. They did not get 30 more years. No one does. But they got 20 more, which was 20 more than many people receive. 20 more years of watching their grandchildren grow. 20 more years of seeing their children succeed and build their own lives. 20 more years of quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. 20 more years of love." Quincy passed first at the age of 76 after a short illness. He died in the bed he had shared with Georgia for 5 decades, surrounded by his family. His last words were to his wife. "Thank you," he whispered, his hand in hers. "Thank you for saying yes that night in the snow. Thank you for building this life with me. You made everything worthwhile." "I love you," Georgia replied through her tears. "I will love you forever." "Save a dance for me," Quincy said with a faint smile, remembering their wedding. "Wherever we meet again, save me a dance." "Always," Georgia promised. He closed his eyes and was gone, slipping away as peacefully as anyone could wish. Georgia grieved deeply but not destructively. She knew Quincy would not want her to stop living, so she continued on, surrounded by the family they had built together. She spent her days with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing stories of Quincy and the life they had built. She lived 3 more years, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. When her time came, she passed in her sleep, a smile on her face. Her children liked to think she was dreaming of Quincy, of that promised dance. They buried her next to him in the Fort Collins Cemetery, on a hill that overlooked the town they had helped to build. The gravestone was simple but meaningful. Quincy Yardley, 1842-1918. Beloved husband, father, and grandfather, Georgia Emerson Yardley, 1844-1921. Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, together in life, together in eternity. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations. The store building was still standing and operating 100 years later, a landmark in Fort Collins. But more than the physical legacy, Quincy and Georgia left behind something more valuable. They left behind a family that understood the meaning of love and commitment. They left behind a community that had been enriched by their presence. They left behind a story that would be told and retold of how a winter storm had brought 2 strangers together and created something beautiful. Because that is what love does. It takes 2 separate people and creates something greater than the sum of its parts. It builds and grows and touches everyone around it. And the love between Quincy and Georgia had done exactly that, spreading out in ripples that would continue for generations. Their great-great-grandchildren would stand on that same rise where Quincy and Georgia used to talk, looking out over the ranch, and they would know they were standing on ground made sacred by love. By 2 people who found each other against all odds and chose, every day, to build a life together. The winter storm that brought Georgia to Quincy's door had been terrible and dangerous. It had killed others and destroyed property. But it had also been the catalyst for something beautiful. It had brought together 2 people who were meant to be together, who were perfect matches in every way that mattered. And in the end, that is what everyone remembered. Not the hardships or the struggles, but the love. The enduring, steadfast, joyful love between a cowboy who had thought he wanted to be alone and the woman who had shown him the beauty of companionship. The love that had built a family, a business, a legacy. The love that had started on a cold winter night when a stranger collapsed on a lonely cabin doorstep and found not just shelter from the storm, but a home for her heart. That love lived on, in the land and the buildings and the people. It lived on in the stories told around dinner tables and in the values passed down through the generations. It lived on in the very soil of the ranch, nourished by the sweat and tears and laughter of 2 people who had loved each other completely. And somewhere, perhaps, Quincy and Georgia were together still, having that dance he had promised, still partners, still perfectly matched, still writing their love story in whatever realm comes next, because true love never really ends. It transforms and continues, echoing through time, inspiring and uplifting everyone it touches. And the love between Quincy Yardley and Georgia Emerson had been as true as love can be. It had started with a winter storm and a moment of desperate chance. It had grown through shared work and mutual respect. It had deepened through the raising of children and the building of dreams. And it had endured, unshakable and eternal, a testament to what is possible when two people truly find their perfect match. The story of that winter storm and the love it brought became legend in Fort Collins. Parents told it to their children. Teachers shared it in schools. And every time a blizzard hit the area, people would remember Quincy and Georgia and smile and think about the unexpected gifts that storms sometimes bring. Because sometimes the worst storms bring the greatest blessings. Sometimes getting lost leads to being found. And sometimes a stranger at the door turns out to be everything you never knew you needed. That was the legacy of Quincy and Georgia Yardley. Not just the land they had settled or the businesses they had built, but the proof that love can bloom in the most unexpected places and circumstances. That two people from different worlds can build a life together. That hardship and challenge can be overcome when faced with a partner by your side. Their love story became part of the fabric of the West, woven into its history and folklore. It was a reminder that the frontier was not just about cowboys and cattle and conquering the land. It was also about people finding each other, building families, creating communities. It was about love flourishing in harsh conditions, growing strong and deep like the roots of prairie grass. And so the story ends where it began, with a winter storm and a cabin and a moment that changed everything. With a cowboy who thought he wanted solitude and a woman who taught him the beauty of companionship. With two strangers who became the perfect match, proving that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, brought to our door by forces beyond our control. The storm passed. The snow melted. The seasons turned. But the love remained, constant and true, a light that never dimmed. And that, in the end, is all that really matters. Not the details of daily life or the struggles along the way, but the love that sustained them through it all. Quincy and Georgia Yardley lived and loved and left the world better than they found it. They built something lasting from nothing more than determination and devotion. And their story, like all great love stories, reminds us that we are capable of more than we know. That love can overcome any obstacle, that the right person makes everything worthwhile. That winter storm so long ago brought more than just snow and cold. It brought two souls together who were meant to find each other. And in doing so, it created a legacy that would endure far beyond their mortal years, inspiring generations to believe in the power and possibility of love.